Welcome back. Finally got this engine cleaned up, now ready to put it back together. You can see here I've decided to paint the end of the head black and grind up the fin so they're silver, and then I've painted the middle section silver, and it's actually come up really nice. So the first thing to do is put the bearings in the bottom and upper case. I use a bit of alcohol to make sure there's absolutely no grease or oil behind those bearings. It's a good idea to wear gloves because you don't really want to get your fingerprints all over them. You'll notice some have got grooves and some haven't, but once that's done, what I'm doing here is just putting a bit of assembly lube on the selector shaft, and you'll see in a moment that there's a little notch on the selector shaft which needs to line up with that hole just where my finger is. You can see it just there, that notch, and what that is a little sort of dowel goes in there, and it's what locates the neutral position. So with this little nut, you put a spring in. The little plunger there is what pushes into that dimple in the shaft that you just saw before, and as I said, that's what holds it in the neutral position. The selector shaft doesn't have to be exactly in the neutral spot, because when you put that in and you turn it, it'll locate itself, but you can see here it sort of locks in. You can see that it's definitely in neutral. This is the transmission, so the bearings all have little pins to stop them from rotating. It's important that they are rotated to the right spot, and you can see the little cutout in the end bearing. So output shaft goes in, the seal's already on there, new seal, and just lower that in gently, and there's also a clip on the bearing which stops it moving sort of in and out, but you can see the gears slide on these forks, and this is how the gear selection actually works. So there's 3 forks, 2 on the output shaft, 1 on the input shaft, and that's how it travels through neutral, first to 6th gear. So put the forks together. There's the first gear selector. The end of those has a little pin, fits into the gear selector assembly, which has got like a grooved section. So as you change gears, those grooves allow those forks to move sideways, and you can sort of see here how it works. Once that output shaft's in and the gear selector's in, what I do then is get the input shaft, and the input shaft goes in. There's a pin. Make sure that pin is in the right spot, and also on the right hand side, this bearing, what I'm doing here is just rotating that right hand bearing just to get it to engage with the pin that fits into the hole that's in that bearing. And you can see here on the left there, the pin's sticking up. I haven't got that in the right spot yet, but I'm just checking first by rotating the gear selector that the gears actually change and mesh together. So you can see this is working its way through the gears. So you'll see in this video I use assembly lube a lot. You really don't want to do all this work and then start your engine up without having some lube already around the place. So can never be any harm. There's this pin.
Okay.
Lift this up, rotate it into that little groove there. This particular engine looked like being pulled apart before, and somebody had actually done the casing up with that pin in the wrong spot, and it's on that bearing there. If you looked closely, you can see it was squashed down a bit, and there's just an end seal. What we're doing now is just putting the con rods on the crank. So again, clean the bearings up, use alcohol, make sure there's no oil underneath the base of the bearing, and then you put assembly lube on the running face. So I'll do that to all of them, and just slot them in. There's a little tab on one side, so you can't really mess it up. There's also an arrow on the pistons, so the arrow needs to face towards the front of the engine. And take your time, do each one of these. These bearings are actually in pretty good nick out of the second crank that I bought, so I decided not to buy new ones. They're all within tolerance, so there's no point. Tensioning these up, make sure they're rotated properly. They're tensioned up to about 30, I think it was 30 or 34 Newton meters, which is not overly tight, but take time. I normally go 15 to 20 to 34, so just got my tension wrench out here. and locking them in place. Once I had them tensioned up, I just add a bit more assembly lube on the sides of that conrod, because whilst I had it on the bearing, I didn't have it on the sides, and that just ensures, as I said before, that when this starts, it's already lubed up from the first rev. You really don't want to start this and wait for your oil pump to pump oil around. Put assembly lube again on the crank bearings. This is the upper casing. It's just turned upside down. There's also a thrust bearing. Now this thrust bearing is not what I've seen before. Normally they're in two halves, but in this particular engine there's only one half on the base for some reason, but that's how it is. So make sure you've got that. The other thing is when you put before you put the crank in, you need to make sure the pistons are actually off, because they don't fit through the hole. And the other thing is, absolutely don't forget to put this timing chain on before you put the crank in, because it basically won't go on. So once you get the timing chain on, the pistons are off. Before you do that, there's a chain guide which you stick through the bottom there. It's got a little pin through it, and there's a couple of pillow blocks, I would call them, that you can see here. Push them in, and then when the other casing goes on, it sort of holds that into position. So that needs to be in before you put the crank in, otherwise it just won't go in. So get that in, make sure the pistons are off, and then it will just drop down through the rear side as I'm doing here. So lower that into position. All looks pretty good, and it's then at the point where put the crank seal on, and then you want to use a proper sealant. Stuff I've used is a 1207B, which is the equivalent of what Suzuki state in the manual. The face, there's no gasket, so you just want to clean it, make sure it's really clean, clean it with alcohol, make sure you don't get any goo on the bearing surfaces. So just giving it a final clean here. You don't need much. You know, these are machine faces, that the gap's probably a couple of thou, so you just want to put a small coat on of this 1270B, which seemed to work really well. Smear it on. If it does go into a bearing face, wipe it off, and you could wait a few minutes. You know, it takes a few minutes to get this done properly. Just smear it on like I'm doing here. Then I've just used the glove just to spread it out so it covers the whole face, and you want to do that all the way around. And once that's done, you only do that on one side as well. There's no point putting this stuff on both sides. Once you get it done, you just lower the casing on, and this casing actually went together pretty nice, and I've got all the bolts in the right spot. And what I do is I use a anti-seize product, Castrol, like gold. It really is gold. It's amazing stuff, and a tube like that will probably last you for a very long time. So I've done that, then I tension them up in the right order, so that you don't tension just from one side. What I've done here is the primary mesh on the oil pump has 3 bolts. I've changed these socket head bolts just for the hell of it. You should have a bit of medium strength bolt retainer, which is what I've used there. It's just a Loctite product. There's probably a few different options with this, but I've just screwed that down, and that just ensures that really big particles don't get sucked into your engine. So it's just a wire mesh. Here's a high flow filter. There must be different versions of this because it comes with 2 seals, so pick the right seal. On the bottom of that cap there is actually a spring. Don't forget that spring, because that spring actually is what pushes against the filter to make sure it's held in place. So if you forget to put that spring, you're probably not going to be filtering your oil. That goes on, filter's ready to go. Here's the sump, and put a new gasket on there. I've bought a premium gasket kit, you know, for a few dollars. Get good gaskets. You can see the gasket's quite big. It's almost like Suzuki used that as a bit of a baffle as well as a gasket. So again, all socket head bolts I've replaced. Tension this up. Don't need any gasket goo. Just put the gasket on, do it up, it'll be fine. You only really need gasket goo if there's a join in the casing. So That's one of the last bolts from the other side. Just drop it in, tension it up properly, and at this point the transmission's together, the crank's in, the rods are in, and it's time to put the pistons back on. So make sure you've marked them, the arrow's pointing the right way on the top of that piston. The gudgeon pin there, it's a reasonably firm fit. It's not a press fit, it's sort of what I'd call a transition fit. Push it on, do that obviously 4 times, and it pays to put a rag around this when you put the clip on, and be careful that you don't stab yourself as well. It's easy to lose that clip, and you definitely don't want to drop it in the engine. So there's the arrow pointing forward. I marked them all because I've obviously matched these to the bores. Got the gasket on. Again, no goo, no gasket goo is necessary on that base. You can see the timing chains there, and the chain tensioner arm is in. You absolutely don't want to forget that because it won't go in at this point. The cylinder casing has very good chamfers on these bikes, so it's a bit of fiddling. You probably need another pair of hands, but you don't need to compress these rings to fit them in. The chamfer's actually quite big, and you just guide them in. Obviously 2 pistons are up and 2 are down, so you can guide the first 2 in, wiggle its way down. Chain's still sticking up, make sure you hold that chain up. This is a metal multi-layer gasket. Just put it on there. That gasket is actually has a light sealant on it already, so again you don't need any sealant. Make sure the timing chain is up. So here's the head, it's all been done up. Same thing, feed the timing chain through and gently lower it down, and that should go on quite nice. There's copper washers that for the head nuts, and they need to be tensioned up in the correct order as well. So once I got it to this point, that went together actually quite nice. Turns really nicely. There's 3 washers that go on here, so there's 2 smaller ones and then a larger one before the flywheel goes on. You can see the oil pump there just on the bottom left. I did actually decide to put a new seal in that, which you'll see in a minute. This is the gear selector, spring goes in there, little plunger, and the plunger connects onto the gear selector signal mechanism, which is that thing just there. Put a new O-ring on it. The O-ring doesn't actually come in a kit, but I just had a couple spares laying around, so I bung one of those on. Bit of glue on there just to make sure it doesn't rattle loose, and there's a gear selector all done. This is the gear selector seal. I've gone this far, I thought, you know, for a few dollars, may as well change that and stop oil coming out. Here's the head nuts. Put them in carefully with the copper washers and tension them up in the right sequence. Need quite a small version of socket there. These are done up from memory. I think they're 22 Newton meters, which isn't overly tight. So I've got a smaller torque wrench here. Just do them steady. I think at this point here I'm only at about 10 Newton meters. So I went 10, 15, 20, and I finished up at about 22. And so just take your time, make sure it pulls the head down nice and even. Here's the gear selector arm. That just simply goes all the way through the engine. There's nothing on the inside. Just pokes through to the other side. You see it come out here. And on the clutch side, you just got to get that arm under the clutch selector, and you can see where my finger is. There's a little spring that needs to fit in that pin right there. So make sure that's located properly, and you'll be set. This little arm here connects onto another spring, and this is what this does. It fits under the gear selector shaft, and that round disc on the left hand side sort of wedges in between pins that are behind that large washer under my left hand, and it's what sort of holds the transmission in a certain gear. So as you feel it click, what it's doing, it's actually clicking over that roller. Tension it up, put a bit of glue on it, make sure it's still free to turn. So that all looks good, and what I'm doing here is just giving it the final tension with the torque wrench. Here's the gear selector. This is pretty simple. All that holds it on is just that washer, and there's one clip, and this clip pushes on and actually goes on there pretty nice. No problems there at all. Here I'm just checking that before I go too much further that the gears are smooth, they're changing, all seems pretty good. So I don't see any issues here. It seems to have gone together really nicely. If you do put this together and something feels tight, you should really just stop and check what's going on, because there should be no issues like that. Here's the cover. Spent a bit of time polishing that. It come up real nice. So again, socket head bolts. I'm not going to put it on overly tight because obviously it needs to come off later when I set the chain on and so forth. But yeah, it's looking awesome. I did polish all those covers, and it's a good contrast against that silver. This is the advanced mechanism. You can see underneath there's a little groove just there, and there's a pin on the crank, so that's what determines its position. And this is there's a timing mark on here. It says a T with a line. It looks like it says T1, but I think it actually just says T. Here we're going back a step. I got that oil pump seal and took this pump out again. Wanted to put a brand new seal in it. I think it was the only seal I hadn't replaced. I thought, what the hell, let's do it. This is the flywheel. It's about to go on. You can see I've already done that pump seal again. Behind the flywheel is this little gear. This gear is what drives the oil pump, so definitely don't forget that gear. You'll be in lots of trouble without that. This fits in. It's quite snug. There's not much room, but what you do is you put this in, and the spacer goes in later. So the reason the spacer's there is to allow enough room to get it in. So the spacer's about to go in here. Just again put a bit of oil on it, and there's two tapped holes. You can see they need to face out, and the reason they're there is when you pull this thing apart, if it's tight, you can just screw in a couple of bolts and pull it out. Large washer goes on. At that point now is the clutch basket. So clutch basket goes on. Once that's on, put the nut on, and this nut's got to be done up to, I think it was about 50 Newton meters, but check the book, 50 or 60. You need to have the right tools to do this. So here's a plate I just had a bit of aluminium laying around, cut a hole in it big enough for the for the socket to go through, put a couple of bolts to hold it. And the idea of this is you're not putting tension through the drivetrain to hold this while you're doing that nut up. So don't try to wedge a screwdriver in somewhere to be able to tighten that nut. You'll just do damage. It is a bit of a hassle, but like anything, right tools, it makes it easy. So that is way overkill, but you know what, it makes it easy. Once I tension it up, just put that washer over just so that it's never going to come undone. This point, this is the clutch mechanism. This is what is a needle valve there, needle bearing, and that goes through the clutch basket, and it's what the clutch lever rides on to make the clutch go in and out. So just putting the clutch assembly together. This is not assembly lube, it's just a bit of engine oil. Again, for the sake you've got it apart, you may as well put oil here. It needs to be oiled because it is a wet clutch, so you don't want to overhaul an engine and have a dry clutch for the first 50 revs or so. So a bit of oil makes a big difference. There's a solid plate and then a fibre plate, and there's probably 6 or 7. Put them all in, and then once they're in, you just put the front casing on and do the bolts up. So this front casing has springs on it. The springs are what's tensioning against the plates, and ultimately is what's providing drive for the engine. They're only small bolts. They're 10mm sockets go on these. They don't need to be done up overly tight. Bit of gasket glue. As I said before, you only need gasket glue where the casing joins. So I've just got a bit on each side there. Again, that gasket is bigger than this mating surface, but I think it's there mainly as a baffle. I spent a bit of time polishing this side cover as well. It's come up real good. Put the screws in, socket head again, come up really neat. And that side there is pretty much done. While I had it off, I actually spent a bit of time and cleaned up that sight glass, the all sight glass. Now at this point we want to get the cams in. You can't really make a mistake because one says IN and one says EX, so exhaust and inlet, you can't really get that wrong. And one's got a gear. Put assembly lube, feed it through the chain obviously, otherwise it's going to be a nightmare for you. Once you get that's the inlet side, same thing, assembly lube, unhook your chain, put that in. To get the timing right here, there's some marks on the front. So the first one is on the base here, that T. So the T needs to line up with that little notch you can see just on the top casing. That determines that it's at top dead center. When it's at top dead center, the exhaust cam here has a number 1 and an arrow. That arrow needs to be rotated so it's level with the top of the head. So in this case it looks like it's one tooth out, so I'm just going to rotate this clockwise one tooth to get the arrow to line up. And then what you end up with is the number 1 and the arrow is flush with the head. When that's like that, the exhaust cam has another one. It's right where I'm pointing now, it says number 2 and an arrow. On that arrow you put a mark on the pin and then you count 23 pins from there, and then that 23rd pin needs to line up with the inlet cam. The inlet cam needs to be rotated here because it's in the wrong spot, and it needs to line up to the number 3 and the arrow on the number 3. So I'm just rotating it here to get it right, and you'll see in a moment. I'll put a bit of light on it. So there you go, number 3, and that arrow lines up with the 23rd pin, whilst on the other side it should say number 2 and line up with that pin, and on the number 1 arrow on the exhaust side it should line up with be flush with the head. So without the chain tensioner, you can see the chain's loose, don't worry about that. When the chain tensioner goes in, that'll tension right up. So top dead center down the bottom, once again, get those timing right on the cam and you'll be pretty set. So just putting the cam bearings in here, they don't need to be done up overly tight. From memory I think they're about 15 Newton meters. Do them up in an order so that they're just evening the load, so one end then the other end perhaps, and just take your time with it. Assembly lube, again, you'll see me use assembly lube a lot. Lubrication is a key thing. Ultimately it's what kills most engines, and it was the one thing that caused problems in the first place with this engine. So just tensioning these up, inlet and exhaust. And you can see on the exhaust side there's a little drive there just on the left hand side of the chain. That's for the tacho. So once you've done that, what I did is adjust the tappet clearance. So use feeler gauges. They all need to be around 0.1 to 0.13, and do that on all 16 valves. This is the starter mechanism, so that starter flywheel rotates only one way. The bolt on that holds this on, this is held on a taper. It is extremely tight. This needs to be 110 to 130 Newton meters. There is a 22 mil open ender that you can put on the end of the shaft to hold it. Once you do that, again, more assembly lube. Oil is going to take a while to get to this point, and this is just what the starter motor is driven by. So just put a bit of grease around the O-ring of that starter motor and a little bit on the drive gear, and then it just pushes straight in and seals up on that O-ring face. Once I had it in, it's just held by a couple of bolts on the ends, which you can see the brackets for. I've used stainless steel socket head bolts on most of this engine, apart from the high tensile bolts. Once the starter motor was in, just put the cover on, and then I was able to bolt up the cam chain tensioner. You can just see the chain tensioner there. There's a little plunger. You just need to have that adjusted so that that spring allows the plunger to go in and out. Once I did that, I just put some new O-rings on the carby inlet holders. You really want to put new O-rings there to make sure it doesn't suck in any air. And this is pretty much ready now for the carbies to be installed.
Once that chain tensioner is on, it really does tension up the chain quite tight, and you'll see just here how tight it is. That is normal, and this is all set, ready for the cam cover to go on. So I did spend quite a bit of time polishing the side covers as well as the cam cover on this, and there is a little bit more polishing I need to tidy out, but it's pretty close now. So there's the cam cover. It's probably 80% where I want it to be. So the next steps from here is I'll finish off the carbies, and I'll make a separate video for the rebuild for those. The engine's looking great, and once the carbies are done, the next step will be starting on the mower frame itself. So lots more to come. It's going to be a pretty unique project, so stay tuned.